Well, welcome back, everyone. This is Brad Boyson joining you from Dubai and United Arab Emirates. This is our weekly human capital management impact chat session. And we are true to our international nature, talking to our subject matter experts from all over the world. And this week, we have our guest joining us from Tokyo, Japan, Shunsuke. How are you, Shunsuke?
Good, very good. How are you,
Good.
Brad?
Ogenki desu ka?
Genki desu. Good Japanese.
Honto. Yeah. It's one of the things that I love about the experts that we've brought together with HCM Impact is the global footprint, and it's part of what makes ISO 30414 and the ISO standards in HR unique too, is that they're born global. And I was having a conversation with someone just last night, and they asked me that question. Well, how can you have something, like HR that you have standards with when so many things are so localized? And I think we were talking to Jeff Higgins earlier on, and his session will be launched shortly. And Jeff had a great answer to this. He says, well, how do the accountants use one accounting system or two internationally, the IFRS or the GAAP in the United States? And it's because we're talking about standards. We're talking about standards in service. And if it can't be standardized, then it's not a standard. So as I mentioned to you before the show, I used to work for a rather large Japanese company. So I'm very fond of Japan, lived there for a few years. And so it's an honor for me to talk to you. And I miss Japan a lot. But before we get into more details, maybe you could just introduce your background, and perhaps how you became involved in this ISO 30414 project.
Sure. Thanks, Brad. Again, my name is Shunsuke Hosaka. I'm a management consultant working for a Japanese consulting firm called Dream Incubator. And I used to provide services to my clients, which was related to succession planning or leadership development. And I've been doing those services for about 10 years now. And last year, I came across to ISO 30414, and I was always questioning myself whether the service we provide to clients, is it really a global standard, or is it the best practice when it's seen globally? So when I saw ISO 30414, I thought it could provide an answer for that question. And actually, I think it did. So that's the first contact I had with ISO 30414. And I started studying about it. And I came across a member of TC 260 and learned about it and got the personal or individual ISO 30414 certification for it. And I became the first Japanese ISO consultant.
Wonderful, wonderful. So we've planned to talk a little bit about consulting today in our discussion with you because of your background and the different ways that the ISO standard can be applied, whether that's individually or by an organization level. It can be used as a tool for upskilling people working in human capital or HR. Maybe the place to start from a consulting perspective is how are you using this standard as a consultant?
Okay, when we do ISO consulting, we start with doing the kind of fit and gap analysis. That means using ISO 30414 as a kind of tool to measure where the client stands now. I mean, whether their HR practices are global level or not. By doing that, we can see whether their HR practices or the data they have are could be disclosed quickly or soon without any modification. But if the gap is big between the ISO requirement level and the HR practitioner level, there needs to be some modification, or there needs to be some practice to be done to get the data for disclosure. So what we do is the first checking the client's HR practices, or what kind of HR system they have, and see whether they stand compared to the ISO 314 global level. That's what we do.
And are you finding that the interest in, and I mean, you're based in Tokyo, so I don't know if it's fair to speak for all of Japan, but certainly in the Tokyo area, where's the demand coming from? Is it the small enterprise? Is it the medium enterprise? Is it the huge multinationals that are so famous in Tokyo? Where do you find the most interest to the standard?
It mainly comes from big companies.
Okay.
Those are publicly listed companies, and it's because as the situation in US or in EU, the investors are having more interest in human capital or intangible assets. So big Japanese companies are starting to think about human capital.
Fascinating. I understand from information that you've sent out to our group earlier that the government and the regulators in Japan are also getting involved in the human capital transparency and reporting. And I know a lot, we talk about the SEC, the United States, and what's happening there, because obviously that's the largest economy in the world. A lot of countries and multinationals benchmark against US companies or the US economy, as you know, with the dollar and the stock exchange. What's happening from a regulation point of view in Japan? I think a lot of our viewers would be curious to know what's happening outside the United States that's aligned with what's happening within the US.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Last month, there's a corporate governance code in Japan, which kind of SEC in US,
Okay.
FSA in Japan. Okay. It's provided by those institutions, and the corporate governance code was amended last month, and it was the first time that human capital, the word human capital, became mentioned in the corporate governance code. And the code requires now companies, listed companies, to disclose human capital information. And also it requires companies to have a kind of succession plans, or have diversity in certain critical positions. So the new corporate governance code in Japan is really aligned to the concept of ISO 314. And I think it is now in Japan that the listed public companies in Japan is almost their obligation to disclose human capital information now.
And is that requirement in terms of, you know, comparisons between what's happened in the US, is it outlined as reporting in terms of principles, or is the regulation being more specific and actually pointing to metrics as a requirement in Japan?
It's actually principle based.
Okay.
And it does not mention about specific metrics, but it asks companies to disclose certain information in the board level, or human disclosure, or there's certain narrative
Yeah.
explanation in
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. And how about ISO in general? Because I think people who know this broader reporting requirement also know that the government regulators they don't point to any one standard per se. They recommend standards that would meet their expectations in terms of reporting. And that's consistent with sort of a principled approach. How well known are ISO standards in Japan, and how readily accepted are they in terms of the market and organizations?
I would say companies have started to recognize ISO 314.
Okay.
Yes, I would say about 30% of listed companies now know about ISO 314 or
Wow.
the global movement of human capital disclosure. I think it's still not so many, but that's what we are trying to increase. That's what we are trying to do. Increase the awareness in Japan about ISO 314. That's what we
Well,
are trying to do.
I certainly think that ISO, and part of the reason I asked the question is, if you ask the question from a US point of view, ISO is not that well known outside of sort of technical experts, engineers, and other types of work where you come across these traditional tangible standards. And when you get into the intangible standards, human capital, it's new everywhere. But I learned about ISO standards while working for a Japanese company, Mitsubishi, many years ago. They were one of the first companies in the world to become ISO 9001 certified. And so that's where I learned about ISO standards many years ago. So why do you think, we have a large number of individuals in Japan that are upskilling on this standard, yourself included, you being one of the first? Why do you think that there's this sort of grassroots interest at the individual level, the consultants, that arguably is a bit stronger than other markets in the world right now? What's unique about the Japanese market in terms of human capital?
Okay, I think the way Japanese companies managed their business or managed their workforce, it's really aligned with the concept of ISO 314,
Nice.
the idea of human capital disclosure.
Yep.
Many companies or many people say people are our most valuable asset. Japan is no exception, and
Right.
it's really believed in that way. And the Japanese management system or labor culture, it's kind of long-term, it's based on a long-term point of view.
Yes.
For example, maybe you've heard of a lifetime employment system in Japan.
Salaryman.
Yeah. Or promotion based on seniority.
Yeah.
That's still a strong force or a strong labor culture in Japan.
I'm sure.
But it supported the strength of Japanese companies or success in the 90s and or until the 80s. So many Japanese companies still have those working environment or working culture. So it is kind of based on a long-term value creation. And that's why I think Japanese companies are very interested in ISO 314, because it's also trying to see the value of an organization in a mid to long term. So I think Japanese companies are interested in it because it could express their strength or the strength of management system by using ISO 314. I think that's the reason why it's kind of acceptable or very got interest in Japan or Japanese companies.
And yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You know, when I worked for Mitsubishi, one of the things that I was really proud of that company's culture was the attitude they had about HR, because they, even, you know, 25 years ago, the idea behind HR was kind of a Jack Welch mindset of, this is the second most valuable function in our organization, but to do it well, you have to understand the organization holistically. And so a lot of, you know, my bosses and the leaders in the HR team for Mitsubishi Corporation, they had rotated through different operational roles. They had worked at subsidiaries. They had been expats around the world. And then towards the second half of their career, they were put into a very responsible position in HR. And this was 25 years ago. You know, so these practices of showing the long-term thinking and the importance of human capital are certainly part of the modern Japanese miracle, for sure. What about resistance? You know, in terms of, you know, when we talk to the Germans or the Americans or, you know, the Australians, every market kind of has its own sort of hesitation about the idea of standards in HR. What kind of resistance do you come across in the Japanese market as it relates to ISO standards in HR, and how are you addressing those pushbacks?
Yes, there are certain resistance, especially when it comes to ISO standards.
Okay.
They have their past experience in
Right.
environment or so they think ISO standards are something made by Western society.
Yep.
So they have those kind of resistance. And when it comes to disclosure, they are forced to disclose very short-term, quarterly information. So they have that kind of a mindset. So it's first difficult to talk to Japanese companies about ISO 314. But when I start to address the merit of using ISO 314, which I mentioned earlier, that aligns with the Japanese companies' management system or working culture, they start listening and they start to become more interested in it. And they, some companies will start using it as an internal KPI for their HR system.
Nice. That's a great story. And well, I love what you've done in terms of managing expectations, because to me, that's where the localization of this sort of comes into it. In terms of strategic partnerships, business partnerships, whether it's consultants, assessors, different roles that people can play in this process, is realizing that the needs for one organization might be different than another. One, it might be compliance for a regulator. Another one, it might be benchmarking against competitors. And so that is a role that the consultant can definitely add value. Here's a question though, and I know these are fairly new HR standards or human capital standards, but do you have any success stories that you can share with us that demonstrate the value add? You know, ideally, and you don't have to give, you know, company names or anything that might be sort of confidential in terms of your business, but I think that's one of the positives too at the time we're in right now, is being able to demonstrate where organizations have benefited by implementing these standards. Do you have any examples that you can share?
Yes, I do.
Wonderful.
There's one of the biggest material company in Japan, which we did the initial ISO 3414 fit and gap analysis consulting.
Mm-hmm.
And we did a 2-month project with them. And as a result of that consulting project, they were able to find 3 things. And first one is they were able to see where they stand compared to the global HR practices.
Right.
And the second one was they were able to set internal KPIs, and so that they could see improvements by using them. And above all, they recognize the importance of HR strategy that aligns with their business strategy before they disclose the human capital information. So they found the importance of strategy, business strategy and HR strategy. That was the
That's a
3
great
key
example. No, it's
findings.
and it's so holistic too. Where do you see, in the different roles that the different stakeholders play in this? You as a consultant based in Japan, who's ahead of the curve. You are, the first to be individually certified in Japan. You believe in this, obviously, by your actions. If you were to jump ahead, say 2 years from now, and have a vision of how things have changed as a result of this movement, this project, how would you envision success 2 years from now? How would you articulate that?
I would like to have about 5 Japanese companies organizationally certified in Japan.
Yeah.
And of course, after consulting, it comes assessment,
Yes,
or audit, and organizational certification. So we are now doing the first step. And after doing that, we would like to go for the organizational certification or standardization with our colleagues around the world. So I would like to have 5 Japanese companies certified.
That's a wonderful goal. And I think a lot of our colleagues have sort of similar goals in different parts of the world. And it makes perfect sense. If you believe in something, it's something that you obviously have to demonstrate the evidence of the value add, but it's also something that drives you, and it's personal. And so I guess, as we come towards the end of our time, we've talked a lot sort of from the business case point of view, from the organization point of view, your background, but how about from that personal side of things? What personally motivates you to lead this? Because, Japanese cultures, a lot like Arab cultures, are more group-based, and this is me speaking. I'm not speaking for human capital impact. That on some levels, they're less entrepreneurial than perhaps other markets, a Silicon Valley, for example. You are obviously, doing something that is leading, that is setting the example for others. Where does the personal motivation come from? The technical, you've explained very well. The business case, you've explained very well. What drives you on a personal level to support this project?
Yeah, 2. The first one is I want to have Japanese companies being able to disclose their human capital information in a kind of fair way. That means the Japanese working culture or working custom is a bit different from the Western working culture. So
I know.
I want to how can I say? I want to make sure they can compete fair with foreign companies. So I would like to help them disclose their human capital information, which can show their real strength, and so that it could be evaluated fairly. So that's the one aspect of my individual goal. And the other one is I like to create a new business in Japan using
Nice.
Human capital disclosure, or ISO 3414. Dream Incubator is a business producing company.
Right.
And what I'm now doing now is producing a new business based on human capital. So I would like to start a new business by this new movement and with this new global network, together with many Japanese companies. That's my second aspiration.
It's a wonderful example. And, it's, I'll paraphrase, and if I get it wrong, correct me, but, it's kind of a form of healthy competition, more transparency, more objectivity, allows the strengths in different cultures, in different countries, in different industries, in different people. And, I'll share with you a bit of, my personal motivation relates to what you're saying is, as a lifelong HR practitioner, I want to see a higher caliber of person enter the HR profession. And that's not to take away anything from the personal motivations of people who work in HR, why they come into HR. But as I'm sure you know, HR is one of the most bizarre types of work
Right.
of people's background. And it's very diverse. And sometimes that diversity is to a strength, but sometimes it's to a weakness. And people learn some things on the job through mistake that they probably should have learned at a more foundational level. And I see these ISO standards becoming part of that more earlier indoctrination into the professional practices of HR globally. And that global part of it is so powerful too, because you can move away from this idea of saying, oh, well, this is Western business, this is Japanese business, this is, Indian business, this is European business, because by definition, these are born global or born international. And it's a lot like the Olympics that are about to happen in your hometown. What brings people together for a competition like this is, this healthy competition to, raise the bar for the human condition, what's possible, develop people, inspire people. And I think there's a lot of similarities to what we're doing, not to over exaggerate, to something like the Olympics, which is, let's face it, it's standardized, right? The 100 meters is 100 meters. It's not 110 meters for Usain Bolt because he's too fast, and 90 meters for other people for whatever reason. And it brings out the best in us in a very healthy, competitive way. And our friend Hilger too in Germany was saying something similar, as he wants to demonstrate the strength of the German workforce globally and increase healthy competition and be more transparent on these things. And I think in human resources, we've had a history of, taking this idea of confidentiality and creating a box and putting a lot of things in there in terms of, how we do business, how we develop as professionals, including what we're doing exactly right now, which is sharing professional information to advance the profession, to advance our personal development, and hopefully in the process, add value to the organizations that we work with. So any final thoughts you want to share with us based either on what we've talked so far or something maybe we haven't mentioned that you'd like to share?
I think we've gone through most of what I'd like to say. So I think I'm good.
Okay, good. And maybe how about this question for you, sort of as a close, is are there any websites for Japanese that you would recommend? Obviously, a lot of business information, you know, the language of global business is English. But specific to the people who might be watching in Japan, are there any resources that you would like them to follow or notice?
Yes, we as Dream Incubator, we provide a website for human capital or human capital disclosure. So it would be good to access our homepage, web page, and we will start creating an English version as well.
Oh,
So
nice.
uh, first Japanese version, but second English version in our web page, and we provide informational global movement to Japanese clients and the movement in Japan to our global friends through that web page.
Well, Shinsuke-san, arigatou gozaimashita. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so
Thank you
much.
so much for your time today and sharing your wisdom. And we wish you the best of luck with your consulting. And thank you again for, you know, raising the tide for this project globally.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Brad, for your time
All
and
right.
having this interview.